Resuming debate. The honourable member for St. Paul's.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the Liberals will be supporting this bill, but yet again want to express our concern that the government seems to not understand what a parliamentary process is supposed to look like, and that when thoughtful people come to committee and when the committee travels to the north, that the thoughtful people who've been dealing with these issues for a long time deserve to be heard in a real and meaningful way that is a two-way accountability between citizens and knowledgeable citizens and the Parliament. Yet again, the government has refused to accept not one amendment to this bill, and I just want to say that the government seems to think that amendments wreck bills. I think we on this side think that amendments are there to improve bills, to actually close weaknesses that have been identified by the witnesses, and really our amendments reflect what we heard. And as the member from the Western Arctic said, that the thoughtful people who came to committee actually had crafted these amendments themselves, and yet the government refused to listen. As I've said in this House before, the Liberal Party understands and supports the goal of bringing further clarity to the regulation of land use in the North, and in particular the dispute resolution process for surface and subsurface rights. The 2008 McCrank report made it clear that the North is struggling with gaps in surface rights legislation to resolve disputes between landowners who did not want to grant access to their lands for development projects. With an estimated $8 billion worth of mining investments ready to pour into Canada's north over the next decade, the Liberal Party supports closing these legislative gaps. However, as the member from the Western Arctic said, we are not sure why this wasn't done in two dedicated bills to the two jurisdictions being folded into this one piece of legislation.
This government needs to have a much more holistic approach to economic development in the North. Part 1 enacts the Nunavut Planning and Project Assessment Act, which implements certain provisions of Articles 10 to 12 of the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, of the 1993 agreement.
Since 2002, Aboriginal Affairs in Northern Development Canada, Nunavut Tungavik Inc., NTI, and the Government of Nunavut have been working on developing the legislation through the Nunavut Legislative Working Group. This work has been supported by the Nunavut Planning Commission, the Commission, and Nunavut Impact Review Board, the board. We are troubled about the concerns raised by NTI that portions of the bill regarding Nunavut do not mirror the language in the Land Claims Agreement and the government's refusal to address these concerns with the amendments that they proposed. We also heard from the Nunavut Planning Commission that based upon current information, an initial $2,918,284 is necessary to effectively prepare for and implement the new legal requirements which accompany the legislation. In addition to this needed funding, $1,878,284 of indexed core funding will also be required for ongoing implementation responsibilities. We heard testimony from Sharon Echaloyak of the Commission, who made it clear we will not be able to enact this legislation without additional funding. There is just no question about it, end quote. And it's not just the Planning Commission who is raising concerns. Mr. Rick Myers, the Vice President for the Mining Association of Canada, told us that, quote, most of the boards across the North have been marginally funded, if you like, if not underfunded. They do not get the work done and deliver good product, but they do it at they do get the work done and deliver good product, but they do it at some challenge. I think it's very important that the co-management boards be funded properly. We are concerned that if those responsible to implement the legislation don't have the resources to do it, we are setting them up to fail, and Northerners will not see the benefits that are expected from this legislation. It was disappointing to hear the minister speaking this morning, the member from Nunavut, to not be able to give any assurance that there would be funding to accompany this legislation. The government's response to this concern is that necessary money will be provided through the implementation phase of the process. Essentially, the government has said simply, trust us, we will handle it. Don't worry about the needed funding. But Ms. Ekaloik testified that the government has told us that it's moving forward as cost neutral. That's been unacceptable. We will not be able to fulfill the obligations if the legislation moves forward without the funding. End of quote. In fact, the Nunavut Planning Commission has been trying without success to negotiate an implementation contract for years. So how can we trust this government when they say that they will now resolve this issue, this crucial issue of adequate funding? The goal of Part 1 of C-47 is to ensure that any project proposed in the Nunavut settlement area will be carefully examined for its potential impact and benefits. The Nunavut Planning Commission and the Impact Review Board will examine, consult, and respond to specific project proposals, determine whether they conform to the land use plan, and assess how these projects will affect the Nunavut settlement area. This determination will require appropriate consultations, but affected parties and relevant organizations may not have the financial resources to participate effectively or at all. That is why Liberals have called for a participant fund to be established to ensure that proper consultation will take place. This is at the suggestion of many witnesses and many Northerners who felt that a participant fund was not without precedent. When the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act was enacted, Sections 57 and 58 recognized this challenge and provided there for the participant funding. All other parties to the working group advocated to such a fund, but the government alone refused to agree with the negotiations, and it was disappointing to hear the official make it sound like that was approved, when indeed it was quite clear there was only one party at the negotiations who refused to agree to a participant fund, and that was Canada. When Liberals later proposed the responsible minister to establish a participant funding program to promote public participation in the review of the projects, the government again refused to consider it. C-47 is an incredibly complex legislation, and the portions pertaining to Nunavut are the product of more than a decade of negotiation. We have heard concerns from the Land Claims Organization, NTI, about some of the language in the legislation not mirroring that in the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, and concerns from the Nunavut Planning Commission about a lack of funding to properly implement this legislation. The Nunavut Chamber of Mines and the Prospectors and Developers of Canada testified that given the complexity of this legislation, further refinements and adjustments will be necessary, end quote. Given this complexity and these concerns, a mandatory 5-year review of how this legislation performs once implemented would have been prudent. But the Conservatives refused our amendment to insert such a review out of hand. The Conservatives government refused to accept any amendments, regardless of how sensible or minor or bottom-up, is truly troubling. En ce qui concerne la question plus générale,
when it comes to the broader question of northern development in general, Liberals are of the view that unlocking the tremendous potential of the North is much broader than merely streamlining surface rights regulations and the dispute resolution mechanism.
For example, the federal government still has no plan or capacity to clean up a major spill in ice-field waters. Canada must develop the capacity to respond to environmental threats, such as an oil or gas spill resulting from resource extraction in the Arctic. These emergency response capacities must be part and parcel of any streamlining of the regulatory process for land use in the North. Northern economic development will also require investments in basic needs like education, housing, and health, but also the infrastructure that is required to support a growing population and economy. The Prime Minister doesn't actually seem to understand Northern development. It has to be more than military deployments and extracting northern natural resources. Northern development must also deal with the societal, social, and economic welfare of the people who live there. For instance, Canada has a serious food insecurity problem, and in northern communities, some estimates put it as high as 79%, or 8 out of 10 people without sufficient food. Food Banks Canada report Hunger Count 2012 brings that struggle in disturbing focus. The report notes that one of the few long-standing food banks in the territories has seen an alarming 18% increase in use over the past year, and that residents in Iqaluit spend 25% of their total expenditures on food, compared to the Canadian average of 11%. Yet this government, Conservative government, has stubbornly refused to admit that the Nutrition North Canada, that the program that was supposed to deal with this situation has failed to bring down the costs of weekly food budgets. The stark reality of Inuit education today is that roughly 75% of children are not completing high school, and many who do find that their skills and knowledge don't compare with those of non-Aboriginal graduates. Low education outcomes are associated with adverse social implications, including greater unemployment, greater numbers of youth entering the criminal justice system, and greater incidences of illness and poverty. Without equal access to education and training, Northern Canadians will not benefit from the employment opportunities that resource development will create. Instead of developing appropriate programs to address this need, the Conservative government is actually cutting existing support. For example, the Conservative government has ended the successful Aboriginal Skills and Employment Partnership. Canada's resource sector companies were some of the most active participants in this program and have criticized its cancellation. There also remain critical gaps in terms of transportation, such as the planned development of a deep-water port at Nanisivik that has been scrapped in favour of a part-time, summer-only fueling station. Iqaluit
is still without a deep-water port, and the Premier of Nunavut, Ms. Ariak, recently remarked that the lack of ports and roads connecting northern communities to one another and to the south is a barrier to economic and social development.
In short, Mr. Speaker, unlocking the tremendous potential of the North is much broader than streamlining the regulatory process for land use and development. The government needs to have a much more holistic approach to economic development in the North. However, as I said earlier, despite the fact that this bill is by no means perfect, we do believe that there are significant positive aspects to the legislation. Mr. Speaker, in closing, one of the great privileges of being a member of Parliament is getting to see all over this wonderful country. It was in the summer of 1998 that I was first able to visit Nunavut. A year before it became a territory. We had an Arctic caucus with former Nunavut MP Nancy Karatek-Lindell. We were then visiting Baffin and Grise Fiord and Resolute, that just captivated by the majesty of the land and the dignity of the people that live in Canada's north. I think I've been back at least once a year ever since. And it's why the Prime Minister's annual trip to Canada's north is always tough for me, because it never deals with the real problems facing Northerners. Northerners deserve more from the Prime Minister than an annual photo op focused on military exercise, ignoring the real challenges of the people of the North and refusing to listen to the solutions that must come from Northerners. The standard of living and quality of life for Northerners must meet both Canadian and international norms and minimums. The Arctic Millennium Development Goals are way behind. The federal government must invest in basic needs like education, housing and health, but also in the infrastructure, like the ports that will be required to support the growing population and the economy, as well as the natural resources extraction. The Prime Minister doesn't seem to understand Northern sovereignty. It has to be more than military deployments and extracting natural resources. Northern sovereignty must also deal with the social and economic welfare of the people who live there. Our northern sovereignty depends on Northern peoples. It's time he listened to them and worked with them on their priorities.